Good evening, everyone. Hello, thank you so much for coming, and welcome to this Spiked US Unsafe Space Tour event, Is the Left Eating Itself? My name's Tom Slater. I'm deputy editor of Spiked, the online magazine. I'm also coordinating this Unsafe Space Tour, and I'll be moderating this evening. Thank you all for coming. Also, a big thank you to the New York Law School for hosting us, being just about the only college on Manhattan who would have us after the antics we've been getting up to on the previous couple of dates. And also to Nadine Strossen, who is a professor here at the New York Law School, former president of the ACLU, great defender of free speech, who is hosting tonight. There we go. So she's hosting us tonight, even though she's not actually here. But nevertheless, she's with us in spirit. So, is the left eating itself? So at Spiked, we're a left-wing radical humanist magazine, and we've always stuck up for free speech, no ifs and no buts. And as a result of that, you often find yourself defending the right to speak of people who you either vehemently disagree with or downright despise. But what's been quite interesting is that whilst seemingly even about over the last 10 years, you could say that generally speaking, the sorts of speakers on a campus or more broadly who would find themselves protested against, the subject of calls for censorship, tended to be conservatives, right-wingers through to downright reactionaries. Things seem to be changing over the last couple of years. So not only does it seem that the bar for censorship, for what is beyond the pale on campus, seems to be getting lower and lower, but even avowed left-wingers, progressives, feminists even have found themselves the subjects of protests and calls for censorship from campus activists. And a number of those people are actually on this panel tonight, but even beyond that, you don't have to go far to look for examples of it, whether it's the feminist Germaine Greer being picketed for her views on transgenderism, or someone like Slavoj Žižek, who was protested at the Left Forum here in New York last year for some colourful comments he'd made previously about the refugee crisis. So that's really what we want to look at tonight, that dynamic, if indeed it does exist. And have today's young radicals abandoned freedom of speech? Are they turning on their forebears? Or is something else going on? Are they simply holding previous generations of progressives to a higher standard? And indeed, is this all just a little bit overblown? Are these unrepresentative groups of students who, for whatever reason, universities and institutions are capitulating to? So that's the sort of thing we're going to be getting into tonight. And I'm delighted to be joined by what is, to my mind, the perfect panel to discuss this. So I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they'll speak. So first up, my immediate left is Brendan O'Neill. Brendan is the editor of Spiked. He's also a columnist for Reason and The Spectator, the author most recently of A Duty to Offend. And most pertinently for this evening, he was banned from the University of Oxford in 2014 at a debate on abortion, where he was due to make the pro-choice case on the basis that he, as a person without a uterus, their words, wasn't sufficiently credited to contribute to that debate. So it'll be interesting to hear from Brendan. Speaking after Brendan, on his left is Laura Kipnis, known to many of you, I'm sure. Laura is a feminist, essayist, and academic. She's a professor of media studies at Northwestern University and the author of many books, but most recently, Unwanted Advances, which really builds on a lot of her critiques of what she calls sexual paranoia on campus. And her writing on this subject has not only earned her some protests at Northwestern, but also some pretty shocking Title IX investigations, which I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about as well. So it's fantastic to have Laura here. Speaking after Laura, we've got Angus Johnston. Angus is a historian of student activism and student government. He's a professor at the City University of New York. He's contributed to many publications, Rolling Stone, the Chronicle of Higher Education, Inside Higher Ed. You might have seen him on MSNBC and C-SPAN, and he regularly speaks on campus and is a very staunch and passionate defender of student activism past and present. So it'll be fascinating to see what Angus has to say tonight. And then finally, on my far left, we've be hearing from Bret Weinstein. So Bret is an evolutionary theorist and a former professor of biology at Evergreen State College. The reason he is former is the fact that, as many of you will know, he was at the centre of a big national news story when he criticised an anti-racist protest on campus, which was asking white student and faculty to stay away from the day. As a result, the subject of a lot of protests and calls for his resignation. So our speakers are going to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes tops. We may have a little bit of discussion on the panel, but as quickly as possible, I'm going to throw it out to you guys for your questions and your comments, and that's how we'll go for the rest of the evening. So Brendan, do you want to kick us off?
Thanks, Tom. My answer to the question, is the left eating itself, is no. for the simple reason that what we have on campuses in the US and the UK today is not left. This hyper-racial consciousness, this insistence on female fragility, this paranoid philistinism so that books are defaced with trigger warnings and everything from tabloid newspapers to sexy pop songs can be banned. This disavowal of your own autonomy, your own adulthood, and you're pleading with bureaucracy to provide you with psychic comfort. This use of racial phrases like white men, as if all white men have the same privilege, as if class, the building block of left politics, was irrelevant or such a small thing that it didn't bear talking about. None of this is left. None of this is what I understand to be left. In fact, it has far more in common with the politics of reaction than it does with the politics of the left. It is a replay, in my view, of the carnivals of reaction that greeted the rise of Enlightenment thought, the birth of mass democracy, the liberation of women and ethnic minorities from second-class oblivion. In my view, today's campus agitators better resemble the reaction against those progressive, radical leaps forward for humankind than they do the progressive, radical leaps forward themselves. They are not left. I know this sounds like semantics, but it's incredibly important that we get this right. I know they call themselves left, but North Korea calls itself a democratic republic. People lie. And more importantly, people use progressive phrases to disguise reactionary agendas. That is a long-standing historical phenomenon, and that is what we face on campus today. The dressing up of the new reaction against Enlightenment thought as something progressive. I think what we face on campus today and across many institutions in the West is something far worse than left-on-left battles. We face the slow motion, agonizing death of Enlightenment thought and the return of reactionary ideas. Just on why I think they are not left-wing, and we really must stop calling them left-wing, just a few examples. The first thing is that this new campus radicalism completely grates against the idea of universalism, which is one of the key ideas of left-wing politics from the French Revolution onwards. The idea of the common man, the rejection of the biology or the politics of race and the politics of division in favor of emphasizing common interests. The new radicalism completely grates against that. It does it through always emphasizing the fragility of black students, the culpability of white students who benefit from historical privilege and therefore are culpable for the crimes of history. You know, when I visit American campuses, I'm really shocked by the politics that is on offer to students. It's either black self-pity or white self-loathing. That seems to me to be the only options in radical politics on campus today. A highly racialized, hyper-racial politics. And it's really emphasized in the phrase, stay in your lane. Don't ever dare to mix too much with the other race or offer too much solidarity to the other race because you're getting above yourself. You should stay in your lane. You can also see it in the way in which this new radicalism completely grates against the idea of class. As I was saying earlier, their use of the phrase white men, this amorphous phrase, you know, white men are bad, of course, all white men are bad, even the white men who historically helped to develop the Enlightenment and radical thinking and so on. They're all bad, they're all the same, and they all enjoy privilege. It's complete negation of the idea of class, the key dividing line in modern society, and the foundation stone of left-wing politics. You can also see the way it's not left in the way it demeans women and ethnic minorities. Women are presented as fragile, as requiring Victorian-style chaperoning through daily life. They couldn't possibly negotiate the ups and downs of public life and student life and sex life on their own. You think that's left-wing? Can you imagine Rosa Luxemburg or Frida Kahlo, famous communists who had affairs with all sorts of people, shrinking in case if someone offered to buy them a drink or if someone touched them on the shoulder? It's ridiculous. This is not left. They demean ethnic minorities too, with their acquiescence to the idea of microaggressions, where everyday conversation is presumed to be hurtful to certain minority groups, or their champion of the removal of certain statues or the renaming of certain buildings. I've heard radical students talk about the environmental menace of statues of old white men, as if ethnic minority students are incapable of walking past a statue without being wounded by it. It is not left to push such a demeaning racial view of certain groups in society. And in fact, what it does, it actually reinvents the biological determinism of the old racial politics, but in the language of historical determinism. They are wounded by history. So in so many different ways, this is not left. This is a reactionary, illiberal politics. And in my view, it has far more in common with the old reactionary politics, particularly the reactionary politics that emerged in the aftermath of the development of Enlightenment thought. And there was a famous reactionary 18th century French philosopher who hated the Enlightenment. He thought it was the worst thing that ever happened. And his famous line was, his name was Joseph de Maistre, his famous line was, "There is no such thing as man." He said, there are French men, there are Italian men, there are black men, there are white men, there are poor men, there are rich men, but there is no such thing as man. And whenever I hear student radicals crying about white men, black people, women, and everyone having different ideas and different views and the need to control public interaction to protect people's feelings, I always hear the echo of that anti-universal, anti-progressive, anti-radical cry. There is no such thing as man. I think what we have to recognize is that on campus right now, we face something far worse than left versus left or left versus right, or the alt-right coming in and stirring things up and left-wing people crying as a consequence. We face a generation that has been schooled to reject Enlightenment thought, schooled to reject due process, schooled to reject freedom of speech, schooled to reject the ideal of autonomy, and encouraged to see themselves as fragile and weak and requiring bureaucratic, therapeutic scaffolding in every area of their lives. That is not left. That is the opposite of left. That is the opposite of radical, and it needs to be challenged by everyone who seriously considers themselves to be a left-wing person.
Thank you, Brendan.
There we go.
So, Laura, your thoughts, please.
Okay. Well, in answer to the question posed, I'm also going to say provisionally no. I thought I was going to be the first one to say no. If by left we mean broadly anti-capitalist, and if by eating itself we mean broadly the free speech on campus issue, which I take to be the subtext here. I'm saying no, though for a while, even recently, I might have said yes. So let me briefly describe my journey. I don't come to punditry, that is the task of delivering oracular pronouncements in public, especially happily. I'm a left-wing feminist who wrote some controversial things about sexual politics on campus because I find the direction of campus feminism also at the moment conservative-leaning and indeed paternalistic. Some people tried to shut me up by bringing me up on Title IX complaints, in fact, twice. So I wrote about the experience of people misusing the Title IX process to shut people up, and later about other misuses of Title IX I learned about and found myself plunked unexpectedly into the middle of the free speech debates and on the receiving end of a bunch of speaking invites from various groups with a pro-free speech agenda. As someone whom others have tried to shut up, I should naturally endorse the free speech agenda, both out of self-interest and because politically I favor freedom and disfavor authoritarianism. I could easily use my allotted time to rant about campus authoritarians and so on. Instead, for this occasion, I'm going to try out the role of the anti-pundit and speak about the value of negative capability, which was Keats's phrase for the usefulness of intellectual confusion and uncertainty, and the ability to think two opposing things at once, which is parenthetically what the political situation of the moment demands of us, I believe. To take a rigid, unequivocal position or positions in the midst of political disarray, in which the democratic experiment looks increasingly imperiled, in which calling your opponents fascist is no longer hyperbole, is to risk being an idiot. When events are unfolding faster than the adequacy of our language to describe it, I suspect our positions should be provisional and lightly held. In that spirit, and against my own self-interest, let me try on the anti-free speech position espoused by certain segments of the left, but at its best version rather than its shrillest or its stupidest, which is what I think an intellectually honest interlocutor wants to do, occasionally, entertain the possibility that your deeply cherished principles might require retooling in response to changing circumstances or new information. As a leftist myself, that is, an anti-capitalist, I have to start by acknowledging the correctness of the premise that there's basically no such thing as free speech. There's no free marketplace of ideas because some idea mongers have more purchasing power than others or are better positioned in the idea marketplace. Markets don't produce equality and never have. In fact, they produce massive inequality. Look around. Check out some wealth and income distribution data. In this context, I do find it difficult to deny that the free speech argument is a comforting illusion, a cover for the fact that powerful interests determine who can speak and who gets heard and by how many. Will net neutrality last for another 5 minutes, by the way? But I suppose that's the subject for another discussion. Here's a personal example closer to our topic. As a supposed free speech advocate, I myself have been the beneficiary of numerous speaking invites, sometimes with quite nice honoraria attached, to events where there are not infrequently lavish catered dinners where you get served expensive things like filet mignon, because I came to realize the free speech agenda is a well-funded one, with various foundations, often libertarian/conservative ones, funneling money from donors whose politics align in not uncomplicated ways, i.e. anti-regulatory economic policies, with this idea and not other ideas. The other ideas don't get the filet mignon. If you're Black Lives Matter or Antifa, you're probably lucky to get bus fare. As an anti-pundit, I also have to acknowledge that there's no credible absolutist position on free speech. When John Stuart Mill said back in the 1860s that more speech was the solution to bad speech, there were certain structural exclusions he was ignoring. Did freed men and freed women have access to the marketplace of ideas? No, because to have access to free speech, you have to be able to represent yourself, to be part of the discourse. It's not a birthright, it's a political right that, in the case of historically underrepresented populations, has to be fought for. Which brings us to identity politics, which I take to be the other subtext of the question we've been asked to answer. As a leftist, that is, in favor of a politics of redistribution, how can I not be on the side of identity politics? Because I have to recognize that access to resources depends, first of all, on the ability of marginalized groups to be represented. There are better and worse versions of identity politics. Let's pick the best one. Nancy Fraser's formulation about recognition versus redistribution is useful here. We need both. That doesn't mean bowing to the language of microaggressions. It means that you only have to look at wealth and income distribution patterns to know that identity isn't a meaningless category, nor has race somehow been transcended. Okay, but here comes a contradiction. I promised you some. Look, I fully believe there's a fatal anti-intellectualism sweeping American campuses that has to be addressed, and much of it revolves around identity politics and campus cultures that increasingly favor feelings over intellect. When I see videos of demonstrators at Evergreen or Wesleyan saying they don't need to read books because we know what our experiences have been, and shouting down faculty, I too want to blame identity politics. But that's to be as simplistic as the students who want to shut people up who offend or trigger them. Instead, we on campus, and I mean faculty, have to help students get over the theory versus experience dichotomy and understand that experience in itself, by itself, is meaningless. The only way to make sense of it is with distance and retrospect. At the same time, all speech and all ideas don't have a place on campus. There are intellectual standards to be maintained and principles to uphold, and most importantly, the most important one is that campuses are inclusive places, not venues to debate whether blacks or Muslims or trans students deserve social equality. Those debates have been settled. If student Republicans want to invite alt-right and edgy neo-fascist speakers, they can invite them to off-campus venues. If it were 1932, would we invite Joseph Goebbels to campus to debate whether Jews and homosexuals should be removed from Germany on the principle that good speech will obviously trump bad speech and all ideas deserve a hearing? No, and campus presidents should not be doling out hundreds of thousands of dollars in security costs to protect idiots with ignominious ideas that are opposed to our core values. The Goebbels analogy isn't very far-fetched at the moment, as we know. We have white supremacists running the executive branch. We have fascist gangs with guns terrorizing cities and mowing down those who get in their way. African-American voting rights are being systematically clawed back. And yesterday I read in the Times about a white 18-year-old student at the University of Hartford boasting on social media that she tried to poison her black roommate. Yes, I know all the invite Milo to campus arguments. Who do we want to appoint as the idea gatekeepers, etc. But if fascists and racists want to exclude certain identities from the future, these aren't ideas, they're threats. And we have to start making that distinction. The time to stop inviting fascists to campus is right around now. And as a bonus, maybe the Antifa would stay home too.
Sorry, Laura, if I could ask you to just final thought before we move on
Okay,
to Angus.
this is my final thought. Do I contradict myself? Maybe so. Do I know how these ideas would work in practice? No. Do some of our comrades fail on the negative capability front? Do they have excess certainty? Are they maybe a bit too quick on the pronouncements and denunciations? Yes. Are they too quick to play the role of authoritarians and censors? Not exactly new tendencies, as we know. Yes, again, but let's be tough-minded and generous and take them at their best.
Thank you very much, Laura. I should say now, Laura, if you're expecting filet mignon tonight, you're going to be bitterly disappointed. But Angus, your thoughts, please.
Thank you. I have a feeling, well, I don't know what Bret's going to do, but so far we're 3 for 3 on answering the question no. But I really mean it, actually. I really, really mean it. We're obviously in a moment of incredible crisis as a country, right? And I will confess that I find the idea that white male is a useless or amorphous category a little confusing in a time when Donald Trump is the president of the United States, an aficionado and a maestro of white male identity politics, right? This is a moment in history when the politics of white male identity are not only ascendant but weaponized, right? And that doesn't mean that every white male is evil. I hope that that's not the case. But it doesn't mean that whiteness and maleness and all of that are topics that we need to be thinking about and engaging with. And the idea that we can have a universal left is one that I find very appealing in a lot of ways. But you don't get universalism by erasing difference, right? You don't get universalism by pretending that there are no distinctions to be made between us. And you don't get universalism by pretending that we are not all oppressed in different ways and along different axes. That the way that we can build a left that speaks for us all is to build a left that speaks for us all, and that speaks for each of us in our specificity and speaks to our specificity in the various ways in which we are being run roughshod. A left politics in the United States in the 21st century has to be a coalitional politics. It cannot be anything other than a coalitional politics. And so from that perspective, my concerns about the concept of free speech are in some ways similar to Laura's, although I'd take it a little bit further and say, I'm somebody who's been beating a very big drum for the free speech rights of left-wing students over the last year or two, or several, 10. And I have not been given a single filet mignon for that position. There's a lot of folks who are really, really into free speech who are relatively quiet when we're talking about the free speech of rowdy students on campus. And I think we do have a difficulty here that goes back to the way in which we conceptualize civil liberties. I'm an ACLU guy, I'm a First Amendment absolutist guy, and as I was growing up, right, thinking about the concept of free speech, the place you would always go was Skokie, right? That was the example that you would always give. That if you really were for free speech, you had to be for the free speech of the Nazis in Skokie. And the way that was formulated was that to be for free speech means to be, most of all, for the free speech of the people that you hate the most. And the people that you hate the most are the Nazis, so that's where you go. I think that's wrong. I think that to be for free speech means that you have to be for the free speech the most of the people whose free speech is most under attack, right? If the people that you hate the most are relatively privileged in terms of having the ability to avail themselves of their First Amendment rights, then they're not the people that you need to be supporting the most. The people you need to be supporting most are the people who are most under attack. It is very easy to defend the people that we really, really hate, who are the exact opposite of us. It's a lot harder to defend the people who we really, really hate, who are kind of like us. The people who are sort of kind of on our team, but we think are completely messing it up, that's the people it's really hard to defend. That's the people it's really hard to be in solidarity with. Do I have like a minute left?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, excellent, great. I won't use them both. We talk a lot right now about the free speech movement at Berkeley in 1964. Particularly when Yiannopoulos was coming to campus, right? And he was being thrown off campus and people were rioting against him. Everybody was talking about how all of this was a betrayal of the principles of the free speech movement at Berkeley. And, I'm a historian of student activism. I believe powerfully in that moment and that movement. It's one of the places that I think of American students as being truly heroic. But the crucial moment, right, the crucial historical moment in the free speech movement at Berkeley was that speech that Mario Savio gave, right? The most famous speech in the history of American student activism, the cornerstone speech of the Berkeley free speech movement, literally a speech that has been inscribed in stone. And the peroration of that speech, the climax of that speech, is this paragraph. There comes a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all. This is not the language of a man who wants to sit down and debate the people who he is opposed to. This is not the language of a man who is insisting that the people who are oppressing him need to be given a forum. This is a language of a man who is putting his body upon the wheels and upon the gears and upon the levers. And I think that we on the left need to make at least some sort of an effort to reach out to the people who are also on the left, who are putting their bodies upon the wheels and upon the gears and upon the levers right now. Thanks.
Thank you, Angus. And Brett, your thoughts, please.
Yes, it's my professorial instincts are kicking in, and I feel like I should try to synthesize what I've been hearing and challenge a few things, but I'm going to try to stick to the plan. The plan is to address the question, is the left eating itself? And I think there are a couple of ways that we can answer this question. One is yes. Another would be, yes, of course it is. I mean, that may be my lived experience speaking here, but it seems so transparently obvious that that is what is going on that I feel inclined really to move on to the more interesting question, which is why is the left eating itself? But that does mean that I have to address some of what's been said here. How can we disagree? If it's so obvious to me that the left is eating itself, then how am I sitting on a panel with people who are obviously well-spoken and informed, maybe more so than I am, who disagree? And I think in part it's going to come down to definitions, which could be a very semantic, dry discussion were it not for the reason that the definitions are in flux. And so I think we should probably get there soon enough. For the moment, what I want to do is suggest a kind of approach to understanding why this really is the left that is attacking some of us who all our lives would have called ourselves leftists. And the first thing I would suggest is that we may have a basic problem with the game theory of progressivism. It is quite possible that what is taking place is that the left has a bad actor problem that arises out of some of the fundamental assumptions of progressivism. And I don't mean to strike a negative note. I do think it is possible to structure a left that would be more or less immune to a bad actor problem. But what I'm witnessing in the present are bad actors that have control over the entire dialogue, and that is a very dangerous situation. The first thing that I recognized a bit before things went haywire at Evergreen, or at least went haywire publicly, was that the people I was talking to, and most of the population at Evergreen is pretty far left, but I recognized that there was a hidden dichotomy between two populations within the left. One of those populations earnestly wishes equality, and there can be some debate over what it is that is being equalized, but virtually everybody on the left would say that they are for equality of opportunity. Then there is another population that does not wish equality of opportunity. What it wishes to do is to turn the tables of oppression. And the problem for us is that when these two populations are intermingled, they sound alike until the point that you reach something like equality of opportunity, and we are nowhere near that point. At that point, they would clearly diverge, and you would discover that some of the people who had been pursuing some nominal version of equality were really about some radical version of inequity with new people at the head. And I do think that that's what we are facing. And the most confusing aspect of it is that the people who are earnestly seeking something like equality of opportunity are unaware that they have signed up with something unholy and un-American. One of the consequences of this dichotomy, the bad actors having taken control of the movement, is that they have begun to erect structures that lead a lot of people to sign up before they really know what it is that they're signing up for. So you'll find across the dialogue of the left at the moment, you'll find words that once upon a time had a definition that you might have struggled a little bit to resurrect it, but you could have figured out what words like equity probably meant. And those words have taken on very different meanings in the present. And they're actually part of a larger structure. So we have what I would call linguistic booby traps. We have policy proposals on college campuses and elsewhere that are actually Trojan horses that are described as pursuing one thing but actually serve a function other than the one that is on the title page. And then we have stigma that is playing an incentivizing role, or actually more correctly, a disincentivizing role. So people like myself who stand up against policy proposals that put my institution in jeopardy find ourselves faced with a social penalty for having done so. And it seems funny in my case. They came after me with the accusation that I was a racist, and then it turned out that there were a lot of people who could tell you that wasn't true, so it backfired on them a bit. But in fact, none of these stigmatizing concepts really depends on being accurate. The most important thing that they do is they isolate you. And that is a means to an end. These are not logical arguments that are being deployed. This is leverage that is being wielded against individuals that are considered troubling from the point of view of the movement. And I would argue that the best way to conceptualize what this movement really is to understand that we don't get to listen in on most of the actual dialogue that results in the structuring. What we listen in on is the public face of this movement. And the movement is really properly understood as an insurgency that privately has decided that it is entitled to disrupt the functioning of certain things that it regards as, quote unquote, problematic, and that once it has decided that you are problematic, there are no holds barred. If you recognize it as an insurgency and you stop listening to what it says it is attempting to accomplish, it will be much clearer what is taking place. Maybe that's where I should leave off in light of the differences of opinion on the panel. Probably the best thing we can do is try to hash them out. But please consider thinking about this as an insurgency engaged in an action that it understands far better than those of us who are looking on from the sidelines.
Thank you, Bret. Now, I want to go out to the audience very quickly, but first, I would just like to offer you the opportunity to come back on some of each other's points. So if I could ask you just to make one point, even though I'm sure there's plenty of things that people want to respond to. So we'll go down the panel one more time before we go out for questions. So Brendan.
Yeah, I want to defend free speech for Nazis, because the idea that you can have free speech but not for Nazis is such a profound contradiction in terms. That's not free speech, that's licensed speech. That's speech that you are licensed, that is speech you are licensed to enjoy so long as you are not a Nazi. That's not freedom of speech, that's the end. That is the end of freedom of speech. The second you push someone outside of freedom of speech, that's the end of freedom of speech. I have to be really, really honest here. I'm disappointed to hear someone, even someone who has been sucked into the Kafkaesque censorship of modern day campus, make the case for silencing certain voices. And there are two basic reasons why you have to have free speech for Nazis. The first is, if you argue for any kind of speech control, the idea that it will just be limited to people you don't like is crazy. History tells you that's wrong. It's never happened. In Britain, in the 1930s, there were lots of very positive, inspiring working class uprisings against fascists, and some on the left, some ill-informed people on the left asked the government to pass public order legislation to prevent fascists from gathering in public. And the government said, yes, okay, we'll do that. Guess who it was used against? Time and again, this public order legislation. It was used against the left. It was used against communists. It was used against socialists, whose marches were banned, whose gatherings were banned. You are signing your own death warrant when you support censorship of anybody. And that's such a grave folly. The second reason you should support free speech for Nazis is because the only way, and this is a cliche, but it's a cliche because it's true, the only way to challenge prejudice is to confront it head on in the public realm and destroy it with argument and reason. There was an era in which Nazis were arrested under a kind of hate speech legislation. They were punished, they were fined. That was in Weimar, Germany, in the 1920s and the early 1930s. Nazis were arrested for what they published. They were punished, they were fined for what they published. Do you know what they did as a consequence of that? They milked it. They presented themselves as victims. They won more support among the public and among the racist sections of the public by presenting themselves as the victims of authority. If you censor Nazis, you help Nazis. That's what history tells us.
Thank you, Brendan. Laura.
Well, I'll just respond briefly to that. I mean, I understand all the points that you're making because I could make them myself, but you're speaking at a very abstract level about ideas and theories, and I guess I'm talking about from the point of view of somebody on campus who works on campus and teaches and has classrooms of students who are not snowflakes, but oftentimes have personal circumstances that lead them to feel endangered by political circumstances or by threatening language. They're the first generation to go to school. People of color, I mean, the classes I teach, you have like 1 or 2 students of color facing like a room full of white kids. And I mean, those are real circumstances and I'm faced with real people. So I guess that's partly the experience that I'm speaking from. But at the ideal level, I applaud what you're saying. At the reality level, which is where I live, I think it's more complicated than that. And, I think you can, I guess it's easy to come up with the pronouncements, I guess is what I would say to that. I just wanted to say something. I thought what Bret, you were saying was incredibly interesting. But it veers toward a kind of conspiracy level to me that I have question marks about. And I think that one of the things that we haven't talked about that I'm very aware of is there's some sort of propensity toward purity on the left, and this idea of clean hands, and that I think is kind of part of the phenomenon that you're describing, sort of that it's less conspiratorial, but that there's a sort of psychological propensity for the sort of all or nothing kind of politics that we're seeing. So I mean, I think that what we need are more descriptions that are not abstract, but are also kind of take into account the sort of psychosexual issues around, say, purity campaigns in the way that the Frankfurt School approached the authoritarian personality. So I mean, I just think that that's what's kind of lacking from the description, which otherwise I think is actually, quite, I mean, I've been there too and believe the description.
Thank you, Laura. Angus.
Just want to say 2 things about freedom of speech. One is that I think this question of, does free speech and free debate work to defeat fascists and that kind of thing, I think that's an empirical question. And I don't think it's sufficient to say that in the Weimar Republic they persecuted Nazis and then there were Nazis and so therefore you have to have free speech for Nazis. I think we need to look at it in a little bit more complexity. And I think one of the things that I would look at is the question of whether the tactics of Antifa are working right now. And I think there is a case to be made that they are successfully disrupting the organizing of a lot of these white supremacist groups. That the white supremacists are having a hard time getting together. And one of the things that they need is they need to be gathering in public spaces so that the Nazi curious among us can connect up with them in real space, in face-to-face. And if we make it harder for them to do that, then it is harder for them to recruit. Now, is that worth it? Does that mean that we shouldn't do it? Well, that comes back to the second thing that I wanted to say is that when we're talking about free speech and protecting free speech, we need to be very, very clear on what we mean. Because Milo Yiannopoulos does not have a right to speak at the UC Berkeley campus. And I say that as a First Amendment absolutist. Richard Spencer does not have a First Amendment right to speak on any campus. And again, I say that as a First Amendment absolutist. The American campus is a place where it's a community and it's an institution. It is not a place where anybody has an equal right to speak. Fascists are like vampires. They can't come through the door unless you invite them in. They don't have a right to come onto your campus. This is why what Richard Spencer has done in the recent past is he has scoured the nation for campuses, public campuses, that have a policy that say that anybody may speak. That's not a First Amendment thing, that's a policy thing. They have decided to open their doors to anybody who wants to spend the money to rent a room. It's basically like renting a room at a Holiday Inn. And they do this to raise funds. I'll be done in a second. They do this to raise funds. They do it to be nice to people in the community who might not have a place for the knitting club to meet. And so what Richard Spencer does is he engages with this policy in a parasitical way. And what campuses are doing in many cases is they are changing that policy. Texas A&M did it. Richard Spencer wanted to come and they said, okay, well, we're going to close our open door policy. Nothing to do with the First Amendment. His First Amendment rights weren't violated there. But if you look at the media coverage and the public debate around all these fascists on campus, you will see it framed in a very unsophisticated way as if what were in play was the First Amendment, and that is very frequently not the case.
Thank you, Angus. Bret.
So I want to respond to a couple things. So first, Laura, to the issue of whether conspiratorial thinking is the right way to look at this. Again, this may be colored by my experience, but I did face a conspiracy. The details of it are emerging slowly. Friends on the campus are beginning to discover that what in fact happened, what explained 50 students that I didn't know suddenly accusing me of racism and then posting their accusation online, was actually motivated by forces that had decided I needed to be removed from the campus because I was an obstacle to something called the Strategic Equity Proposal, which was a Trojan horse. So I'm not saying it's always conspiratorial, but if you doubt that there is a conspiratorial element, look up the word ally and then look up the word accomplice, and you will find openly discussed within this pseudo-progressive movement, this illiberal left, is the idea that the ally relationship is not the peer relationship that you would discover exists if you looked it up in a dictionary. The ally relationship is a relationship of subordination. And so this is a real problem. Ruling out conspiracy would just be a mistake, I think, because that element is there, which doesn't mean that we should leap to see it every time it's a possibility, but it is something that occurs a certain amount. With respect to the issue of free speech, I must say I'm also now being invited by lots of people who are interested in having free speech absolutists, and I am a free speech absolutist, but I also am left feeling a bit flat by the idea that this is really fundamentally a free speech issue. I mean, for one thing, the First Amendment was built around the founders' fears of governmental oppression, and the greatest threats to our free speech are probably not governmental at this point. So does Richard Spencer have a right to speak on college campuses? Turns out legally he does if they're public, right? Should that make...
If they have an open door policy, which
well,
they don't have to have.
He can go onto a public campus and he can speak, and if they rent...
Plenty of public campuses have closed borders.
Right, but so we can get into the nitty-gritty, but let's say that your college has a policy whereby, a public college has a policy whereby you can rent space, then Richard Spencer has as much right to rent that space at a public college as anybody else does, and you can't bar him. So in order to bar him, you have to eliminate the policy that allows that, and then there's the question of the truly public space on the campus, which it's very difficult to bar such a person from. But my basic point would be, there's a second reason that we shouldn't be so focused on narrow free speech rights here, which is that stamping out the speech of those who have abhorrent things to say isn't going to work. The reason that those messages are resonant now has to do with the place we are in history. And this is something I won't drag you into. I think the biological underpinnings of this are, but I would say the soundbite is that tyranny is the end game of prosperity. And what we have is an era in which prosperity has come to an end, and what we have messages, which I think Trump played on cynically to get elected, there are messages that are now resonant that wouldn't have been so 20 years ago. And so getting some individual who has abhorrent things to say silenced doesn't reduce the demand for the messages that they are peddling. The reason that these people are making progress is that people are now listening for those messages, and anybody who deploys them is going to get a hearing. So the way to approach this is to look at the deeper questions that have put us at a moment of austerity that causes those messages to be resonant, rather than the narrow free speech rights, which are probably not adequate or useful as a way to think about it.
Thank you, Brett. So, at this point, I'm going to throw it out to the audience. So I think we've got a roaming mic going around, if we can see some hands. So panel, I'm going to take a handful of questions and comments. Please be as brief as you can, and then we'll bring it back so you can respond to anything you hear. So don't leap in if you hear your name straight away. But yes, let's take this gentleman here, and then if you would just go to that gentleman in the middle there. Shoot.
Hi, I have a question for Professor Johnston. Is this all right? Okay. So you mentioned about Antifa working against the public assembly of white supremacists, but something I've noticed is that the definition of Nazi seems to be changing very quickly. So let's say that I get together with some friends. Like 3 or 4 people from this room, and say, I want to create a leftist platform that will appeal to people who believe in truth and free speech, et cetera, but that also goes in conflict with some other campus policies and, push comes to shove, and then I'm declared a Nazi by Antifa.
Well, tell me which policy. Because you can't say, and I want to also do some other
Well,
stuff.
let's not get into the particular policies right now, but let's...
Actually, that actually doesn't matter, because if they declare me a Nazi,
Well,
excuse me,
Angus,
can I finish my sentence,
let him
please?
finish his point, we'll move around and then we'll come back.
So the main thing I want to say is, for whatever reason, they've decided that I'm a Nazi, and that they decide to come out in force and to prevent me from speaking. So really, they get to decide whether I speak or not because they're more powerful than me, because they have more numbers than I do, because they're more intimidating. Is that all right? Let's say, for example, that they're wrong, and we can decide that there is an objective way to determine if someone's a Nazi or not.
Good.
What recourse is there?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Another one over here. And could I see some hands on this side? Do you want to take the mic up to while he's speaking? Shoot.
Well, let me just say, first of all, the gentleman over there kind of had a similar question to mine. But let me just say first, Brendan, I want you to acknowledge your accent privilege, because we're such suckers for... The minute you started speaking, I was just like, he could say whatever, and I'm, that accent, forget about it. But Angus Johnston, we're going to be, I guess, picking on you a little bit with the Antifa statement. But yeah, to piggyback on this young man over here on the corner, it's like, for instance, who decides who's a Nazi? You could say they're preventing, white supremacists from mobilizing, which, of course, I think is something that's good, I would say. But, I think about a commentator like Ben Shapiro, for instance, that he's called this and that. He's stopped from going to campuses, and he's having his discussions disrupted. I mean, what about a scenario like that? Who determines who's the Nazi? Some young kids in masks? I don't think so.
Thank you very much. So we had another one just here. Yeah.
My question is for all the panelists, and it is, what do you think is a bigger obstacle for a socialist politics in the United States? Is it fascism and white supremacy, or the Democratic Party?
Interesting. And there's a gentleman in a blue jacket, I think, just a couple of rows back. Yeah, and then we'll come back.
Oh, now.
Yeah, you, go.
Yeah. So my question, we've heard a lot about what this group of people are doing, what that group of people are doing, and what people are saying, and who's meeting in what auditorium. And I think what few people are talking about is, why are people so ready to hear some of these messages? And I think that people, and it doesn't matter, which group or whatever that someone wants to identify with, that there's a lot of fear, whether it's, fear of sexual assault, or fear that, some white guy might do something to me. I don't believe that, but, there's a lot of fear going on. And while we're spending time talking about who's saying what are we actually doing to move people from the space where they are to a more ideal space? What are we doing in action? Because I believe that we can talk about these things all the time, but unless we are actually putting people to work to actually accomplish something, to move them from the position or where they feel afraid, or where they feel they don't have options, by showing them the way to leverage the resources that they have. Unless we're doing that, then what are we doing? So, this is for the panel. What are we actually going to do
Thank you very much. Right.
Just say one thing about
Yeah, sure, by all means, jump in.
I mean, I think that, we have principles on the one side, and then we have things that we all know are true on the other. Or I shouldn't say we all, okay, I won't rope you guys into this, but I mean that on campus, there are invitations going out to speakers for particular political purposes, which is to create divisiveness, and particularly divisiveness along race lines on campus, and to try to create the message that some people do not belong on campus and others do. So when, invitations are extended to certain groups, I mean, it's with a sort of cynicism. And I sort of feel like the principles are great, but we're also getting played. And, so anyway, I mean, I think Angus and I agree about it. I'm not saying don't let people speak, and I also fully understand that somebody like Milo is the creation of the left. I mean, it is the creation of a kind of suppression of a certain kind of quality, and so is Donald Trump probably. But, so I mean, I certainly acknowledge the sort of dialectic of that, but I also think the reality is, yes, let those people speak off campus, not on, because there are certain values on campus that have to do with inclusiveness, and the invites are a direct attack on that principle. I mean, that's the subtext, that's the, thing we all know about them.
Brendan, your response.
Yeah, I think I don't understand what's wrong with having principles, especially on freedom of speech. You should have principles on freedom of speech. And also, there isn't this neat divide between principles and practical everyday life. They inform each other. And that's the example I gave of in Britain, where we have public order legislation that can ban a march. And that came in as a consequence of the refusal of the left to defend free speech and freedom of association for Nazis. These have consequences. If you give up your principles, it has devastating consequences in everyday life. I disagree with, but I think this is entirely about freedom of speech. I think that is the issue in relation to all of this stuff. I think freedom of speech is the foundational freedom. It's the freedom that makes everything else possible. It's the freedom, the right to vote, the right to association, the right to political organization. None of those make any sense or are even workable without freedom of speech, without the right to say what you want, to publish what you want, to distribute what you want. So the fact that there is a new left, or students, or society in general, that is increasingly uncomfortable with freedom of speech should concern us enormously. And in relation to Antifa, Antifa poses as this kind of radical lefty kind of, like the international brigades that went off to fight the fascists in Spain. Do me a favor, the Antifa is a bourgeois, censorious, shrill, anti-democratic, anti-working class. For them, for George Orwell, anti-fascism meant going to Spain and risking your life to kill actual fascists. For Antifa, it means getting a bus into town and punching a working-class Trump supporter in the face. That's not the same thing. And the point I would make is, just the final point I would make is that if you want to see the danger of censorship, just look at people like Richard Spencer and Milo Yiannopoulos. Their fame, their power to the extent that they have it, their influence, the fact that you all know who they are, even though they don't have any good ideas, is entirely down to censorship. The more you censor them, the more you chase them, the more you create this culture of fear around them, as if these two people could destroy America, the more you empower them. Censorship empowers the people it censors. It disempowers the audience, ordinary people who are deprived of the opportunity to challenge backward ideas. Censorship benefits the censored in many instances. Censorship is a real blow to ordinary people who don't share these views and would quite like to hear and confront them. Censorship is a disaster in every single instance, whether it's being enforced by the government or bureaucrats at a university, whether it's formal or informal, whether it's state-led or, in the words of John Stuart Mill, the tyranny of wisdom. Whichever area it's coming from, it is a disaster and it will make life and politics worse.
Thank you, Brendan. Bret.
So I want to come back to this question about socialism, but first I want to just say, I agree with you, freedom of expression is fundamentally important. What I'm concerned about is that free speech, being effectively synonymous in this country with the First Amendment, is not adequate to defend free exchange of ideas, which is really the important thing and equally important on a public campus as a private one. So anyway, I would agree with you that the issue of free expression is the fundamental issue. The First Amendment isn't. It's really inquiry and dialogue that is. With respect to the question of socialism, how, I think if I understood the question correctly, how could we effectively make a socialist program viable, which is a greater obstacle to it, white supremacy or the Democratic Party? I thought that was kind of a cool way of putting it. But I want to level a challenge back, a thought experiment. For all those who have some sort of sympathy with the ideals expressed by socialists, I want you to think for a moment, what would happen if they simply faced no opposition of any kind and were capable of instituting the policies that they favor? Do you think it would work? Now, of course it would work. Well, I have to say I'm ever less convinced that it would. Now, I also think that if we did the experiment on the other side of the spectrum, if we handed power over to economic libertarians and we allowed them to deregulate anything, do you think it would work? No. Absolutely not. So my point is actually this one. If you're familiar, I want to be cautious about the political compass test itself. This is an online test that allows you to diagnose yourself in a 4-quadrant model. I don't know how good the questions are at actually placing people on it, but I do think that the diagram that has 2 axes, a left-right axis on the X and authoritarian versus libertarian on the Y-axis, is actually a very useful way of looking at things. And my point would be that the 2 libertarian quadrants, libertarian left, where I am, and libertarian right, where the economic libertarians are, those 2 quadrants, once they recognize that nobody in those quadrants actually knows the description of the system that we should be building, have tremendous reason to unite, because actually we are agreed about values. We are agreed about the fundamental importance of liberty, and now what we need to do is have a discussion about how practical interventions might be and what those interventions we might propose would be in light of what we now know that those who architected the ideas behind socialism didn't know. So I would say, not to make it too black and white, but the enemy of those who hold liberty as a great value are the authoritarians. And the 2 authoritarian quadrants are actually not united. They don't like each other, and for good reason. So there is great advantage in putting our differences aside in those 2 libertarian quadrants and recognizing that the differences we have are about policy and that none of us have the right answers on that front.
Thank you, Bret. And before we come back up, Angus, so particularly these questions about Antifa, is the young gentleman over there a Nazi, all that good stuff.
Yeah, so I think, well, let me just, out of curiosity, how many people in this room actually personally know anybody who considers themselves part of Antifa or identifies as Antifa? Ah, all right, cool. More than I was expecting. All right, so I think one of the things that needs to be recognized is that Antifa is not just about punching people in the nose, right? It is, there's a lot of different tactics that go into it, some of which are tactics that I think everybody in this room would agree with. Antifa is about organizing against fascism in a variety of different ways. And so I think that it's important to say that there is a spectrum of ways in which you can organize against fascists, and that some of them are ones that everybody in this room would agree with, and others of them are ones which probably just about everybody in this room would disagree with, and then there's a bunch in the mushy middle. And one of the things that I think we really need to do in this country is start having much more of a dialogue about what exactly we mean when we talk about free speech. And let me just give you one example. Protesting against a speaker. When is that an expression of your free speech rights, and when is that a violation of their free speech rights? There is no one-sentence answer to that question. You know, at what point does a
Hold up.
There is 2.
We're coming back out to you in 30
Wait a second,
seconds.
hold on a second. You just interrupted me. Wait. No, wait, listen to what I'm saying, please. You just interrupted me. Did you violate my free speech rights? Did you? Wait, but did you just, right. Okay, so wait, hold on a second. Wait. This is wonderful. I am loving this so much. because I am being prevented from finishing my sentence by people who feel like I am expressing an opposition to free speech. This is great. This is exactly what I'm talking about. Wait, hold on a second. Give me a sentence. Give me one more sentence to say why I think that you have the right to interrupt me. I'm here, I've got a microphone. I've got a lot of power. I've got a lot of power in this room, not as much as the guy with the clock, but I've got a lot of power. And so if I have a microphone, I can speak over you, right? If you are interrupting me, I can push on past you. I can wait till you're done, and then I can respond. I can get the last word, right? There's a lot of stuff that I can do. And so I would say that when y'all start getting real frustrated with me and interrupting me, you are not at all violating my free speech rights. You are expressing your free speech rights. You are exercising your free speech rights. There comes a point, probably. Maybe you cut the mic, right? Maybe you storm the stage. Maybe you pull a fire alarm, right? Maybe there does come a point where my free speech rights have been violated by your disruption. But certainly the disruption that we just experienced was not a violation of my free speech rights. And so it's not just a one-sentence thing, right? Because it's complicated. There is a mushy middle. And
Hold up.
Excuse me, you like Antifa. I'm just doing what they do. You think that would be...
I think and I'm going to do what they do and tell you to be quiet at this point.
Can I just say one thing and then we'll move on? This room of civil libertarians is the first time I've ever been interrupted as a speaker. So that's wonderful. I love it.
Excellent. Right, on this note, we're going to go back out to the audience, not to you. That gentleman over there in the blue shirt, please. And there's a gentleman in a white shirt down here who'll be next. Yes, please.
Hi. I feel like there's been something very omitted from your general conversation and in general around the surprise or kind of reaction to the fact that these kind of politics are prevailing in our present and why? I mean, we kind of have that ready-made answer. We know that over the past decades, I mean, we can time scale it differently, that the left has been in decline in this country, globally, in general. The two parties in power don't offer contrasting programs. They don't offer different rights. They really don't. I mean, they're all part of a bureaucratic nanny state that's been, increasingly developing means of control to keep productive population, relatively happy in a period of capitalist crisis that has been going on basically, since the socialist uprisings of the early 20th century. So I feel like, why is that not being discussed? Why is the absence of politics that are allowing for this, as if it's a matter of the left, as if the left is somehow real in the present? Because I'm a leftist and I'm a member of a socialist party and a member of a study group, kind of lots of things I've done over the past decade as a leftist, but I also acknowledge that I'm in no position of power. You say you have a lot of power because you're on the microphone. I have the microphone right now. I don't feel empowered. As a leftist, I feel disempowered relative to the social situation that we're part of. So I just feel like you guys need to comment on that, the decline of the left.
Good point, well made. Gentleman here, and then who on this side wants to speak? There's someone in the middle there in a grey shirt, and we'll go to you first. Yep.
So I think the kind of pace of indignation at the moment is blistering, and it's really hard to kind of keep up with it. But I also think it's really corrosive. And I'm interested in whether or not you think a model established by Shelby Steele in White Guilt is relevant. So if you think of an oppressing group, acknowledges the sins of the past, that creates a loss of moral authority, and then there's this power dynamic between the oppressors and the oppressed, and there's stigma that goes with it, and I think, Bret, you kind of alluded to this a little. I wonder if you think that model is true, because I sort of thought it was true until I looked at the kind of Weinstein Sexminster scandal, because there I think there is a kind of loss of male authority which sets this thing up, with of course the exception that actually this loss of male authority is largely an invention and kind of hysterical. So I wonder if the left has gone from being aligned to historic causes that had substance to really being nothing but hysteria these days.
Thank you very much. There's a gentleman, just there, and then we'll go to that lady there, and then we'll come back. Yep.
I heard an idea today that I hadn't thought about much, which was that the right hates ideas and philosophies, and the left hates people. And when people talk about Richard Spencer, they don't seem to hate his ideas as much as they hate him. And it seems that kind of animus seems to bind the farthest of the right and the left. And I just want to hear if you have an idea about that.
Thank you very much. And just down here. Yep.
Thank you. I just, by the way, want to thank you for coming to the United States and for doing this tour of yours, and especially, and I've been following Spiked Online for a long time now, and I've been following especially what you've been through, Bret, since it broke, the news broke. One of the things that seems to me that, well, there are two things that's not being talked about. We're talking as if the only fascist threat is on the right. And nobody is really confronting the reality that, and I think Bret brought it up in terms of the authoritarian-libertarian divide, that on the left we're getting as much of an authoritarian push as anything we've ever seen on the right. And the other point, which is included here, is that I'm hearing you talk about generalities regarding, free expression, free speech. But my background, I happen to be the daughter of Holocaust survivors. And I've made it into my dotage, having to really be aware of everything going on around me. And I'll tell you the truth, that I'm much more concerned with the anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic activities on the far left than I am from these I've been aware of the right since I was old enough. Mm-hmm. And, I don't see them as this huge threat so much as the overreaction and the anger that feeds into the mainstream America watching this on the media, wondering who's off control now. So I just wanted to bring that one up.
Thank you very much. Right, we're going to come back to the panel now, who I'm going to ask to be as brief as they possibly can, because I want to try and go out and get a handful more before we come back. So Laura, have you got anything you want to respond to? There is a lot there. Is the left dead? That was my favourite question from over there, so shoot.
Well, I'm trying to sort through all this myself, obviously. I'm kind of surprised to hear you say, the last person who spoke, that you're more worried about the left when, the right and, the Republican Party, as I say, has, stripped African Americans of voting rights, occupy all the state houses, have taken over the Supreme Court, the White House, all and are executing policy.
No, actually, just in the spirit of moving on swiftly.
So,
let's.
There are just these. There's a reality to these political shifts that I guess I actually am more worried about, and am responding to. So it doesn't seem to me that inviting Richard Spencer to campus. The conversation we have been having, I think, divides between whether the free speech issue is idea neutral, and we have to support free speech as a principle, or whether the ideas that are being promoted have efficacy and matter and affect people's lives, particularly on campus, because I'm talking about the campus situation, and how what's said. If we allow white supremacists on campus to organize on campus, we are effectively saying it's okay to create exclusions for other populations, and I think that is opposed to what the mission, what we're supposed to be about in higher education. And so these things, I think, are very worrisome. I take them seriously at a content level, as opposed to, and I guess that was the distinction I was drawing between the principles. That there are specific things happening that we have to deal with, as opposed to, the principle about it. So that's
Thank you,
as
Laura.
much as I can come up with right now.
Definitely. And Brendan, your thoughts, please.
But what you're describing is licensed speech. It's not freedom of speech. And I think it's really important that we recognize that. I think I agree with the speaker here who said that the overreaction to the right is now more dangerous than the right. I'm opposed to Trump. I'm against pretty much everything he's done so far and everything he's said. But Trump derangement syndrome strikes me as a far greater threat to the idea of democracy, to the idea of open debate, to the idea of campus debate, than Trump himself is. I think the reaction is incredibly dangerous. And it's interesting that you mentioned being the daughter of Holocaust survivors. I was at the Museum of the History of the Jews of Poland in Warsaw a few weeks ago, and what was really striking, what you really got from visiting that museum, is that fascism is censorship. And anti-fascism is freedom of speech, because what it had in that museum was all these pamphlets and magazines that people produced in the Warsaw Ghetto, for which they could be shot on the spot. So they had to hide them, they had to print them in bunkers, they had to distribute them in the dead of night, because they were censored by the Nazis from expressing themselves. Nazism is censorship. That's what it is. Anti-fascism is freedom of speech. If you are attacking freedom of speech, you are not an anti-fascist. That is the bottom line of this discussion. You are far more like the other guys. You are far more like the guys who threatened to kill Warsaw Ghetto Jews for publishing pamphlets. Final point I want to make on the heckling question. I think the heckling question is very simple. One of the greatest things ever written about freedom of speech was written in response to the heckling question. It was a plea for free speech by Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, who wrote this piece after a meeting of abolitionists in Boston was interrupted by racists and pro-slavery people and shouted down. And he wrote a plea for free speech, which is one of the best and most passionate things you will ever read in defense of freedom of speech. So that wasn't a First Amendment issue. The state, Congress, government was not interfering with his and the other people's rights. That was a matter of informal censorship, enforced by a mob, or as we would now call them, a protest of SJWs. So this question of informal censorship has been around for a long time, and if you want to know when heckling becomes a problem, i.e. when someone is prevented from speaking, read Frederick Douglass, read the minority groups who struggled for freedom of speech for decades, who you now demean through saying, oh, free speech doesn't matter. That's the shocking thing. Heroes of mine had their ears cut off, their tongues pulled out, they were tied to the stocks, they were pelted with eggs, they were jailed for years for expressing their freedom of speech. The idea that you would now turn against the idea of freedom of speech is a grave insult to history and to the people who made our lives as nice as they currently are.
But you know that, can I just say one thing?
Quickly, if you will.
All speech on campus is licensed speech. Only certain people get to speak. Only certain students get in on the basis of their ideas. Certain people are allowed to teach, on the basis of being judged adequate to speak. We don't let people, like in class, say fuck you to their professor. It is already, there are speech codes and civility codes in place, so it is licensed speech. If groups, that is the bottom line.
No, but the problem is if groups of students want to invite someone because they're interested in his ideas and they want to hear from him, and there is a rule or a policy code or another group of students who prevent them from doing so, that's where it explicitly becomes a freedom of speech question. People are being prevented from engaging in discussion with someone they find interesting.
I think we're going to leave that there and move on to Angus. So anything in response to what you've heard from
the
audience or the panel?
I think that one of the things that I very much agree with that you just said is that the core free speech rights, if there is a disruption in that way, is of the students who invited the speaker, right? Because they are the people who have standing to make the invitation, and they are the ones who are most being interfered with. And I think that we really do need to pay a lot more attention to the free speech rights and the freedom of expression rights of students on the campuses. I think about the Irvine 11 a few years ago, where students who were essentially heckling the Israeli ambassador were arrested and charged with crimes for engaging in protest speech. I'm thinking about the fact that at UC Berkeley, at around the same time, dozens and dozens of students who were peacefully protesting inside an administration building were woken from their sleep and arrested and then taken all the way 2 counties away so that it would take the entire day to process them, so that they, without actually charging them with a crime, they could be taken out of action and not able to join the protest that was scheduled to happen on campus the next day, right? I'm talking about all the students who have been beaten by campus cops, the vast majority of them leftists in the last few years. And I think that the silence of most civil libertarians on all of those issues has really been profound. And if we are concerned that today's generation of student activists do not see free speech as a central right, I would say one of the questions that we need to look at is, when have we shown them as civil libertarians that the right of free speech is one that extends to them and extends to them even when they're being a bit rowdy, and that we are going to stand up and defend them? If all they see is us standing up for Nazis, they're not going to believe that free speech is a real living thing in this country today.
Thank you, Angus. Hold up, and Bret.
So I want to pick up this question about the state of the left at the moment, which I find fascinating in the following sense. Most popular politician in the country today, by far, is Bernie Sanders. That is an amazing statement of fact. It is a heck of a time for the left to be attacking itself in the way that it is doing it. Finally, people are actually listening to a person with integrity who really is on the left, who has important things to say. Why is the left so dysfunctional? And I would submit that there are a couple of things in play here. One of them is that we have a fundamental defect in our political apparatus, and that is a positive feedback, where if you generate wealth, it doesn't matter how you've generated it, it buys you political power, and if you have political power, you can restructure the system so you generate more wealth. That positive feedback system is effectively evolutionary, and it has resulted in the capture of the entire apparatus by people who don't agree on much, except that they do not want change built around redistribution. So we have, and I don't want to call it a conspiracy because it doesn't even have to be conscious, what we have is the evolution of something that effectively forbids redistribution. And what that means is that the left has been out of power for a very long time, and having been out of power for so long, it has lost touch with what it is supposed to be doing, what it is supposed to be advocating, how it is supposed to collaborate, all of those things. So one thing that we have to recognize is that we're effectively, I mean, how many times as things fell apart at Evergreen did it strike me that this is little more than a temper tantrum. This is a temper tantrum that is wielding real power, and that's a frightening thing. So in order to fix this discussion, I would suggest that the left needs to, A, recognize that it needs to regenerate the tools of how to wield power properly and effectively. It has to think carefully and consciously about that question. And it should probably think about revising what it is interested in redistributing. And the reason for that is if we have a discussion about redistributing wealth, we immediately lose everybody on the libertarian right. They are not interested in having that discussion. On the other hand, if you have a discussion about redistributing opportunity so that it is equally distributed across society, the libertarian right is suddenly listening, because a truly ideological libertarian will agree that the system functions better when everybody has opportunity to access the market, to innovate, and to provide superior ideas that can then catch on. So if we want unity that actually allows the wielding of power, we should rethink what it is that we are advocating.
Thank you, Bret. So, we've got about 5 minutes left and nowhere near enough time, but I'm going to try and take as many of you as possible before we bring it back to the panel. So there's a lady at the back there who's had their hand up for a little while, and then we'll also take this gentleman down here for now. So brief, if you will, so we can...
Very brief. Brendan mentioned generational differences, and Laura was talking about what would be the appropriate role for professors in trying to balance students' reaction to their personal experiences versus what they learn academically. And Bret was talking about bad actors. Having seen some of his videos, I know some of those were not just students. They were amongst the establishment in the administration and the faculty. So if you could speak to a little bit about what the grown-ups in the room are doing or should be doing, that would be helpful.
Thank you very much. Gentleman here, and then there's a guy who's really going for it at the back there. Give him the mic, and then you first.
This question's for Bret. I was wondering if there were any evolutionary or biochemical explanations for all of the hardline rigidness that we're seeing with sort of these political outlooks that have become more extreme and fanatic. Thank you.
You? Any hands over here while we're here? Yeah, there's a gentleman just back there. So you first, and then we'll go there.
Okay. Hi. I was going to ask a question about how can we raise awareness to the issues we will be talking about tonight. However, there are some apologists in the room, I can tell. Laura, specifically. As an evil white man, how are you going to talk
not
me
being
down?
liked. It's okay.
How are you going to talk me down from the tower of telling you that progressivism is a failed ideology? You have this system called the progressive stack in which there are oppressed and there are not oppressed. And just this week, we had this sign being plastered around campuses across the country saying, it's okay to be white, and that was considered racist. So I would like to tell you, or ask you, how do you think progressivism is not a failed ideology?
Okay, quickly, so we'll take this gentleman, and then I'm going to come to some here because I've been ignoring you, and then we'll come back. So,
which one?
I thought we already had one. Oh, come down the front here because we've got a clutch of people who I've been ignoring because they were out of my line of sight. So I'm going to take these three here, but you've got to be really, really quick, and then we're going to come back.
Hi, thank you. So one thing I heard from Brendan strongly, and to a lesser extent from Bret, was that you believe that there is a coherent, organized movement out there of people who have values and priorities antithetical to your own. And the prescription for that is to fight them and not ally with them. What I heard, certainly, what I believe I heard from Laura and Angus, is that there are a group of people out there who share your values and priorities, but are misguided and miseducated, which is a very different thing. And I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Thank you very much. And then just you two in that row there, and then we'll have to come back, I'm afraid.
This is for Laura and Bret. I was student government president at a small college called Middlebury. I don't know if you guys have heard of it. During a complicated time, and as sort of a young person trying to think about these issues, it was very challenging to find room for nuance and negative capability. That phrase really struck me when you described it. And Bret, you mentioned social penalty. And I'm wondering, how are young people supposed to work through these very complicated issues while facing the potential for social penalty?
Thank you. And yeah.
On campus, has the educated and conscientious conservative become an inconvenient truth? I'm referring here to the glaring lack of viewpoint diversity at leading universities, and I'm speaking as someone who has literally been called a fascist for saying I believe in objective standards in art.
Thank you very much. Right. Thank you all for your questions. Sorry I didn't get everyone in, but time is short. So, panel, I'm going to ask you to take about a minute or so you can either respond to anything you've heard or completely ignore them and just give us your final thoughts. So let's go the opposite direction now. So, Bret, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I was struck by the question of what are the adults in the room saying, and I would say I don't like hearing myself say this, but increasingly I think most rooms don't have any adults in them, and that's part of the problem. And that sounds tongue-in-cheek, I'm sure, but really what I mean is that the developmental process that results in truly adult levels of nuance, those processes are broken, and this is going to make them worse. If we make universities into places that are antagonistic to inquiry, then either inquiry is going to move somewhere else and it's going to have to build the university system anew, or we're in serious trouble as a civilization because that nuance is simply necessary to navigating.
Thank you, Bret. Angus.
I'd like to respond to what you said about this. Are some folks misguided? And I think that there is stuff that some people need to learn, and I think there is more room for compromise. There is more room for finding community with folks at various different places on the left than a lot of the people in this room see. I've spoken to a lot of these folks one-on-one, and there's a lot more common ground than is often visible in the media. And the other thing that I would say is, particularly in terms of campus activists, we're not supposed to like what they're doing, right? That's kind of the whole thing, that they're supposed to be pushing boundaries, they're supposed to be going farther. And one of the reasons why I am way more scared of the right than I am of the left is that Donald Trump is president, and the folks who are causing the most trouble on campus have very, very little power. Now, you may think they have more power than they should, but we are in a position where the amount of power that is wielded by the people that I don't like on the left is way, way less than the amount that is wielded by the people that I don't like on the right. And I really do believe that there is an immense possibility for real communication and coming together, particularly when you're talking to people one-on-one or in small groups. And I would encourage everybody in this room to seek out those opportunities, because that's where the real change happens, I think.
Thank you, Angus. And Laura, your final thoughts.
One of the ways that I got into trouble on my own campus was by trying to complicate issues that people didn't want to see as complicated, and trying to interject nuance into some of the discussions. This was around sexual politics and rape culture and that sort of thing. And I became the subject of a lot of opprobrium and Title IX complaints. So I feel a little bit like I'm, as I said, tried to be funny to the guy who was accusing me of something or another from the back of the room. Yeah, I'm used to being in a room full of people who don't like me, because I guess I'm, finding myself dissatisfied with taking the easy position. And I guess when I've used the word principle to you, it's because, I would love to take the absolutist position, because then I get the applause and people would say, yeah, and it sounds good and it's comforting to be able to draw these hard lines about complicated issues. But it started to seem inadequate to me. And that's what I actually am trying to sort my way through, that the responses that I fell easily into didn't seem adequate to the current political situation and to my own experiences as a teacher on campus, and seeing students having to confront these sort of issues like white supremacists coming to campus and that sort of thing. So it's lived experience, and I'm not, claiming experience is some special privileged position, but I'm saying it has to factor into the kind of analysis that we make about the present moment.
Thank you, Laura. And Brendan.
I would just say in response to that, free speech is the facilitator of intellectual confusion and doubt and skepticism and debate and conflict and tension. So it's a very, very, very simple idea, which is that no one should ever be censored, but it gives rise to precisely the kind of culture I think that you want, and which I think we all want. The question of where are the grown-ups, that's the question, I think, to ask. And that's what I was getting at earlier on, which is that I don't think this is just gangs of radical left students attacking more moderate left students and so on and so forth. It's something more profound than that. It's the playing out of a long-term generational loss of faith by Western society in its own founding values. And when you raise a whole new generation with no respect for due process, no respect for freedom of speech, to cultivate their own self-esteem and protect their own self-esteem above all else, you make monsters. So it's not entirely their fault. The final point I would end on is in relation to freedom of speech. Angus says, okay, if a group of students is denied the right to invite a speaker, then those students' speech rights are undermined, but not necessarily the speakers. Those speech rights, the speech rights of listening to speech, are the most important rights in freedom of speech, because it's only by having the right to hear everything and judging for yourself if it's a good idea or a bad idea that you can be a full-rounded, free member of society. Censorship tells you not to think for yourself. Censorship invites you to be a child. Censorship says, you don't have to hear this thing because we have decided on your behalf that it's not a good idea. Censorship is disempowering, insulting, paternalistic, and it encourages stupidity. I think the most important, it's very important that everyone has the right to say what they want. It's even more important that we all have the right to hear them and judge for ourselves using our free will and our autonomous thinking, whether they're talking sense or nonsense.
Thank you, Brendan. If we thank all of our panel. Thank you very much, everyone. We'll be hanging around for a few minutes, so please do come say hello and talk about Spite. Thank you all for coming. Cheers.